Ryzen 5000 CPUs are finally in stock. You're going to build one, but you need to know what motherboard to get. Do you get X570, B550, B450, X470, A520, oh my gosh, it's too much. We're going to go through all the features that you need out of a motherboard, and then we're going to go from every budget level to the budget all the way up to the premium motherboards with specific recommendations coming right up. Come on. Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. Today we are going to finally revisit our best motherboard series that was launched before Ryzen 5000 launched, and we're going to update it because finally the Ryzen 5000 CPUs are in stock. We are going to cover everything today, and you're going to walk away from this video understanding exactly what features you need, exactly what chipset of boards you need, and what specific model that you want to buy. Now, of course, that's what this channel is all about. It's about getting you the best price to performance in your builds. If that's content you want more of, remember to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell icon. That way you get notified when we go live. With that, let's jump right into this one. Let's start off talking about how much you should spend on the motherboard. Now, for high-end CPUs, we're talking about the Ryzen 5600X, 5800X, Ryzen 5900X, and Ryzen 5950X. You tend to want to spend about half as much as you spent on the CPU on the motherboard itself, and use the MSRP for that. Differs a little bit from, say, a budget processor where you're going to spend much more of the budget on the motherboard because the processor is so cheap, but I would look in that category. Of course, if you need specialized features in the motherboard like Thunderbolt 3 support or ECC memory, then of course you're going to spend a little bit more. But that's generally what I would look to spend. So for a Ryzen 5 5600X at $300 MSRP, I'd think about spending around $150. What chipsets do you want? Well, let's start off with the ones you absolutely don't want. You do not want a 320. It won't work. It's an old chipset. You don't want a 520 because while it will work, it lacks overclocking features and it's really suited for low-end builds, not a Ryzen 5000 build. Similarly, you don't necessarily want to go out and get an X470 board new because there are only a handful of models still on the market, and frankly, at every price class that they're still offered, there are simply better options. That brings us to the B450 boards, and there are some B450 recommendations in here. However, please note that they did just receive the BIOS updates for Ryzen 5000, and you're going to need to buy a board that probably has BIOS flashback in it in order to use it with a Ryzen 5000 CPU. We'll cover BIOS in just a moment. The other feature that they lack is they lack PCIe 4.0 support, at least officially. And as a general rule, the B450 boards, because they came about during Ryzen's more formative years, board partners weren't really investing a ton in them, and they lack things like high quality audio often. They also lack things like a lot of connectivity and good VRMs. There are a couple exceptions, and they are included in this list. So that brings us to X570 versus B550. Let's talk about the benefits of each. I'm going to tell you right now, 99.9% of you should be buying a B550 board if you don't get a B450 board. Here's why. Both boards have PCIe 4.0 support. The B550 boards have PCIe 4.0 both at the top graphics card slot as well as the top M.2 slot. The X570 boards offer some additional PCIe lanes for 4.0 support and an additional M.2 slot for 4.0 support. However, 99% of you aren't even going to use the PCIe 4.0 that's on those boards, let alone additional PCIe support over and above what B550 offers. The B550 boards, number one, tend to be a lot cheaper. They tend to have better VRMs as a class, although there are some phenomenal X570 boards, and we have those on the list, don't worry. So overall, I'm going to recommend that most of you, if you're just gaming, just doing productivity, video editing work, you're not going to see any benefit out of anything more than PCIe 3.0. So I would consider a B450 or a B550 boards. And those of you who need X570 know who you are already. If you have to ask the question, you don't need it. And I do have some X570 boards on this list for you. So now let's talk about BIOS. Do not skip this section of the video. This is very important. So in order to get Ryzen 5000 to work with whatever motherboard you are buying, it needs to have one of two things. Either it needs to come with a Ryzen 5000 ready BIOS, which very few motherboards, if any right now, are, or it needs to be updated on the board. There are two ways to update the BIOS. One is you buy a motherboard with BIOS flashback on it, you push the BIOS flashback button, and it updates the board using just a USB stick without the CPU. I have a whole video on how to do that. I will leave it right up there in the card for you. The other way to update the BIOS is you have to have a Ryzen 3000 CPU and plug this 3000 CPU in, get the motherboard and the system to post, then update the BIOS, then pull the system apart, and then stick your Ryzen 5000 CPU on it and put it back together again. That is a real pain in the rear, and most of you, I'm guessing, do not have a spare Ryzen 3000 CPU. So in my initial best motherboard series back in the fall, I did give you what I still consider to be the best price to performance B550 board out there. However, it does not have BIOS flashback, and even though I told you you were gambling if you tried it, I got a lot of angry messages. So this time we are not doing any boards that do not have BIOS flashback on them, because I want to make sure that you end up with something that you can work with a Ryzen 5000 CPU. Motherboard form factor. Now, motherboards come in different sizes, obviously. However, there's 3 sizes that you're going to focus on for the purposes of building a new Ryzen 5000 system. And that is ATX, those are full-size boards. Then you have micro ATX, which are effectively half-size boards with just a couple fewer PCIe slots on them. And then there are ITX boards. Those are for small form factor builds. And a lot of you out there I know like to build small form factors. Don't worry, I've got some ITX recommendations in this video. But for most of you, 95%, you're going to buy either a micro ATX or an ATX size motherboard. How do you choose? Well, I tend to like micro ATX motherboards because I don't use most of the PCI slots on a full-size motherboard, and that gives me the freedom to either buy a full ATX size case or a micro ATX size case, depending on my budget and the aesthetics I want to pick. However, some people don't like the look of a micro ATX motherboard in a full-size ATX case, or they simply need those additional PCIe slots on there. So those of you are going to buy a ATX size motherboard. Motherboard features. Now, I'm going to list these in the order that I think most consumers want them on a motherboard and the order in which I've ranked the motherboards themselves. The first one to start out with is connectivity. Rear panel connectivity. How many USB things can I plug in there? They want high-speed USB ports, they want a lot of them, and generally you want at least one USB-C port in there. Then of course we go to things like the network connection. Now, most network connections at this point are at least 1 gigabit a second. Most people do not have an internet that can even take advantage of that, so I discount that a little bit. However, I do include boards on the premium end with like 2.5 gig LAN and things of that nature. Wi-Fi is the same way. You don't have to get a motherboard with Wi-Fi on it. You can always buy a USB Wi-Fi Bluetooth dongle, plug it in, and there you go for your Wi-Fi. I will include links to some of those kinds of Wi-Fi adapters down in the description. Of course, some consumers want to be able to buy a PC case that has a USB Type-C front panel connector to it and be able to plug something in like their phone to it. In order to do that, you need an internal header on the motherboard for USB Type-C. Now, I will say that most cases still do not have USB Type-C, so this often isn't an issue, but I will include listings for motherboards that have them as well. The power delivery on the board itself, called the VRMs, is also important in your decision. Now, if you're just putting together a Ryzen 5600X or 5800X, it's unlikely that you're going to tax that system so much that it will thermally throttle. That's really the thing that you're worried about with the VRMs and the power delivery. So for 99% of you, the VRMs on the boards probably won't matter. However, if you're going to put together a Ryzen 5900X or 5950X, and you're going to heavily overclock that and put it through some really torturous and long duration workloads, this becomes more and more of a factor. So I've taken into account the fantastic VRM thermal testing that Hardware Unboxed did. I'll leave links to their series down in the description on that. As we go through the motherboard recommendations themselves, I'll include which CPUs they're recommended for, including whether or not you're going to be able to overclock them. Of course, we also have to talk about the motherboard audio. Especially if you're gaming, audio is a huge part of the experience. Or if you're just watching videos or something else on it, also a huge part of the experience. But when does motherboard audio actually matter? Well, it depends on what kind of device you're plugging into it. If you're plugging in what's called an analog audio device, something with a connector that looks like this, then you are using the motherboard's onboard audio processing in order to get the sound. If, however, you're plugging in something that looks like an HDMI connector or a USB connector, those are digital connections, and what you're doing is you're transferring responsibility for the audio onto some other device, maybe a stereo receiver, maybe a soundbar or something like that. If you are going to plug in an analog device, the audio does matter to you. So what audio are you looking for? Well, there are different things called audio codecs. And to keep it simple, the audio codec you want is either ALC 1220 or ALC 1200. These are both the high-end audio codecs. Now, it's important to note that some motherboard manufacturers have their own branded version of these codecs. So really, you're just looking for the number, either 1220 or 1200, even if it's like SVB 1220-AC blah, blah, blah. You're just looking for the number in there to make sure you get the right one. And the motherboards I'm going to recommend at the more premium level, I will tell you when they have better audio. The second part of the audio you really want to focus on is how many capacitors are on the board itself. This will have an impact on the overall sound. Quick note, if you are plugging in a headset into your PC and you have an audio codec like an ALC 1200 or 1220, you want to make sure to use the front panel connectors. The reason for this is simple. Those codecs have additional signal-to-noise improvements and signal boost for the front panel connectors specifically, and the ALC 1220 deals really well with high impedance headsets. M.2 and SATA connections for your drives. So most boards now, luckily, come with 2 M.2 and 6 to 8 SATA ports. However, note that on a lot of boards, when you plug in a second M.2, you disable 2 of the SATA ports, you're still left with about 4 to 6 left. So that's often enough for everybody. RGB and fan headers. Some of you are really going to care about this, and some of you aren't going to care at all. Obviously, the more fan headers and RGB headers you have, the more you can plug in without using a controller. However, even if you have a more limited number of them, you can still buy for about $20, sometimes even less, a fan controller, and I'll include links to them down in the description. So I haven't taken these as much into account. And of course, many of the motherboards have onboard RGB itself, and that may or may not be important to you. I'll simply point it out as we go through the boards. We're going to start off with the budget micro ATX motherboards. Links to everything are going to be down in the description. Those links do support the channel, so we'll really appreciate if you use them. Why am I starting out with super budget motherboards for Ryzen 5000? Because if I don't put these in here, somebody's going to yell at me that there's no super budget option. So we're going to quickly go through these. I personally would not buy any of these boards for Ryzen 5000 system. However, they are fine. We're going to start off with a B450 board, which is the MSI B450 Bazooka Max Wi-Fi. If you don't need PCIe 4.0, which honestly I don't think most people do, this board would work actually just fine for you, and it comes equipped with Wi-Fi for only $90. Doesn't have a lot of USB connectivity to it, but frankly, for a super budget system, the VRMs are just fine. For a 5600X, I wouldn't necessarily put an 8-core chip on it, but you could. Nothing bigger than that. Going up the ladder, if you want PCIe 4.0 and a cheap board, Gigabyte's got the DS3H. I hate the names of these boards, but these are always good boards in every generation that they've got, even for their Intel boards. Decent enough heatsink and VRM solution to it. It's got about the same amount of USB connectivity overall as did the Bazooka, which is not a lot, but overall, it does have 2 M.2 slots, which is an advantage, and you do get PCIe 4.0. Now, if you want Wi-Fi with a B550 motherboard, then I would suggest, at the super budget option, the MSI B550M Pro VDH. Now, yes, this board looks like it came out of a Radio Shack with these old school type heat dispensers, but so what? The board does come with M.2 Wi-Fi on it. It also comes with a decent suite of rear panel connectivity to it. You can see there you've got a couple of 3.2 Gen 1 ports. No Type-C though, I will note. It does though have a front panel USB Type-C header. You can see it right there that you would connect to activate your front panel USB Type-C. I would, however, say if you're spending enough in order to get a case with USB Type-C on the front panel, you can spend a little bit more on the motherboard. And then finally rounding this out, not because it adds any features whatsoever really, but just because it looks like it didn't come from Radio Shack, is the MSI Mag B550M Bazooka Gaming. Now, all of these motherboards have a really kind of crummy audio codec. If that doesn't matter to you, it's okay. I believe it's like an ALC 897 or something like that. 1 gigabit Realtek LAN, but overall, they all have BIOS flashback. They'll all work with Ryzen 5000 CPUs, and I would put a Ryzen 5600X on any of these and feel very comfortable with it. Now we're going to jump up into motherboards that I would buy for a $300 plus CPU. All of these have great VRMs. They all have ALC 1200 or better audio codecs to them, and they all have a lot of USB connectivity. Let's kick it off with the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro-P. Now, if you watched my original video back in October, you know that originally Gigabyte came out with the B550M Aorus Pro, had a ALC 1220 codec on it, but the VRMs on this were just okay. They upgraded the VRMs, they slightly downgraded the audio, but overall, this is a fantastic little motherboard, and it's got a ton of USB connectivity, which is something that I absolutely love about it. It's got 4 high-speed USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. It's got 2 high-speed 3.2 Gen 2 ports on it, including a Type-C right there. Full suite of audio connectors, 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN. You don't need me to list out the specs to you. You can see overall, really nice motherboard. Retails for $129 usually. Sometimes it's lower than that, but lately it's been up in the 140s. That's why it didn't quite make the budget range. Moving over then to the Asus TUF Gaming B550M Plus, another really phenomenal motherboard. This one is about $150. It also has a Wi-Fi variant that sells for about $20 more than this one. Overall, better VRMs, slightly better VRMs. I would consider putting a 5950X on this for sure and feel very comfortable about overclocking it. The Pro-P, I would probably stop at a 5900X with overclocking, but really phenomenal boards. This one here, again, similar amount of connectivity to the Aorus Pro-P. In fact, exactly the same amount. 2 M.2 slots, a bevy of fan and RGB headers, but neither of them have front panel USB Type-C header if you have a case that has USB Type-C header. So for that, I would recommend the MSI Mag B550M Mortar. Similarly, great audio. It comes with only 2 3.2 Gen 1 ports and 2 3.2 Gen 2 ports, including a Type-C, which is great, and 2 USB 2.0. So it comes with about half as many USB connections, but you do get the front panel Type-C, which is nice. And look, the board looks great. It's got a great looking audio sections, ALC 1200. Overall, all three of these are phenomenal options. Now we're going to jump into budget ATX motherboards that I would definitely consider. We're going to start off with a couple of B450 boards. Remember, the B450 boards, they lack PCIe 4.0 official support for them. However, I think these two boards are really great. Now, you might ask, well, where's the Tomahawk B450? That's a fine board, but for the price they're charging for it, it lacks great audio and some other things. I think these two are better options for it. We're going to start off with the Asus TUF Gaming B450 Plus 2. They have reintroduced this board, Asus has. It's got great USB connectivity, including a Type-C port on it. It has BIOS flashback now, which the old TUF Gaming B450 Plus did not. The VRMs are increased, so you should be able to put, I'd put up to a 5800X on this. Wouldn't think twice about it. It's got a number of fan and RGB headers and an ALC 1200 series audio codec, which is really, really phenomenal. That's for $120 over at Amazon. If you want something with Wi-Fi and you want like super great VRMs included and all the way up to an ALC 1220 codec, well, there's the MSI B450 Gaming Pro Carbon Max Wi-Fi. That's a mouthful, I know. This is the Tomahawk B450's big brother, basically, the premium line for MSI and in their B450 range. It's got BIOS flashback. It has a really great audio section to it. It has phenomenal connectivity. I have to say, absolutely phenomenal connectivity to it. And it comes Wi-Fi enabled for only $150 for a full-size ATX motherboard. That is really tough to beat. Now let's jump over into more premium motherboards. All of these are going to be under $200, but honestly, I wouldn't see why you would want to spend more. We will go through some X570 boards, and of course, we're going to hit those ITX boards. All of the ones I'm about to show you have an ALC 1200 or 1220 codec, so that great audio sections. They all have fantastic VRMs. I would feel comfortable putting up to a Ryzen 5950X on them and overclocking the heck out of it. They all have great USB connectivity, but let's jump through them individually. I would say getting which one you're going to get is a function of price, because the prices are all over the place. The prices you see right now are probably going to change drastically. Let's start off with ASUS TUF Gaming B550 Plus. Not much different than its micro ATX sibling. Great USB connectivity, great audio on this board. Overall, ton of fan headers. $155 right now. This is the board I would buy if I was buying today. Very close second to that would be Gigabyte B550 Aorus Elite V2. Now the V2 versions of the Aorus boards have a front panel USB Type-C connector on it, although this picture is the old picture, so it's got the wrong picture on it. But you got to trust me that it does actually have that connector on it. So if you need that for your front panel, the V2 version is the one to get. Otherwise, get an MSI board. $160 over at Amazon. Really not much else to say about it. This is a phenomenal board. The VRM on this is perfectly adequate for the 5950X. Overall, great audio. It's got an ALC 1200 codec on it. These all have 2.5 gigabit Realtek LAN. It does come in a Wi-Fi enabled version, which is called the AX. If you don't need the front panel connector, you can get this one for $170. If you do need the front panel USB Type-C connector, it's a little bit more money. It's $15 more. Now we're going to jump over to the MSI Mag B550 Tomahawk, selling for $165 right now over at Newegg. This, again, if you need the front panel USB Type-C, that's really the decider. This is another board to get. It does have reduced USB rear panel connectivity to it. As a result, it does have 2.5 gigabit LAN and a 1 gigabit LAN as well. I'm never sure who the audience for that is, but somebody out there will find a use for it. I'm sure someone will tell me down in the comments. Now, if you're really super into the audio, I have to say that one of the best boards to get for that is the ASUS ROG Strix B550A or B550F. The only difference between those boards is that the B550F comes with AMD Crossfire, so you can put 2 graphics cards on here that are AMD. Nobody uses that anymore. I don't know why they make a special board for it, but they did. But the audio section on this one looks really phenomenal, as well as pretty good rear panel USB connectivity. The other difference between them is the F here, selling for $178, is all black with some red highlights, and the A variant, selling for $180 over at Newegg, is kind of more of a metal white. So if you want a white build, this is actually a pretty good motherboard to look at. Then, of course, we've got the Gigabyte Aorus Pro. Now, this has an ALC 1220 codec as well, $170. However, they do not have a V2 version of this in the United States with the front panel USB Type-C connector. It's kind of a bummer. Overall, it's just a very similar board to the ROG Strix, and since the ROG Strix boards have come way down in price, I would actually consider them ahead of the Gigabyte B550. But again, it's all price dependent because any of these boards are going to be phenomenal. MSI has a Wi-Fi enabled version of the Tomahawk. They basically call it the MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. Identical to the Tomahawk, including that it doesn't have a better audio codec than an ALC 1200, which is unfortunate. $487. The ROG Strix versions that we looked at, the B550F, does come with a Wi-Fi enabled version for about $20 more. And the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro does come with an AC Wi-Fi enabled version for about $20 more as well. Sells for $200 total. Okay, X570 boards. Now, I've already explained why you don't need X570, most of you. So for the 1% or 2% of you that do, let's go through a couple of X570 options right now. So starting off, we got the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Elite Wi-Fi. Now, you could put up to a 5950X on this. I would start feeling a little uncomfortable with the 5950X with super overclocks, but it should be able to handle it with extended workloads. This is a board you can buy either with or without Wi-Fi. The non-Wi-Fi version is only like a couple of bucks less, so just for the Bluetooth alone, I think it would be worth it. It's got a ton of USB connectivity on it, and it does have a front panel USB Type-C header as well. For only about $200, I think this is, if you want X570 with BIOS flashback, so you can use it with Ryzen 5000, this is probably your absolute best budget option, and it's got premium features to it. So to me, I'm not sure why you would spend more money than this, but if you want to spend more money, you certainly can, right? The next one up is the MSI Mag X570 Tomahawk. Now this should be the best budget option, and if you're in other markets, I know this board often does better, but in the United States, it sells for well over its $199 MSRP. You can see right here, it's at $267 when you can even find it in stock. Very good motherboard. Again, if you're in a region where this is a great budget option, go for it. It has a little bit less USB connectivity to it, but it certainly has plenty. And overall, rock solid VRM. Pretty good audio to it as well at the, I believe it's ALC 1200 codec, and a nice looking audio section in terms of capacitors to it. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't include two motherboards that are currently out of stock that everybody seems to want to get their hands on. The first being the Asus ROG Crosshair 8 Dark Hero. Has been sold out since it was announced, really. It's got just a really cool color scheme to it, and if you have the money to burn, look, this motherboard is second to none, for sure. And then, of course, we've got the MSI Mag X570, which, again, is just completely out of stock, but a lot of folks use for benchmarking and testing purposes. It does have the three M.2 slots on it, like a lot of the higher-end X570 boards. It has a pretty nice-looking audio section on it as well. Rear panel is just really phenomenal, super fast speed USB connectivity. But overall, those are your options. All right, let's quickly go through small form factor ITX boards. There's only 4 of them that are realistic because these are the only ones with BIOS flashback. Now, ITX boards, small form factor, you often get a lot less connectivity. They always come, well, at least these come with Wi-Fi 6 enabled, which is fantastic. There are some very small differences, but in terms of price, they all range between $200 and $210, except for the X570 option that I'll show you in a moment. Starting off with the MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi B550i, they all have 2 M.2 slots. However, the one thing I will say, while this has decent USB rear panel connectivity, and it's got the front panel USB Type-C header on it, it does have this active chipset fan, and I'm not, pardon the pun, but I'm not a fan of these. What happens if this fan goes out? Yes, you can probably replace it, but what happens if it gets noisy? Is that something that you want to put up with? I would rather, for a better passive cooling solution, which we're about to see in the Gigabyte B550i Aorus Pro. It's got a heat pipe here to the chipset, which is a really interesting cooling solution. So you don't have that active fan. I really do like that. Has a little bit more USB connectivity than its counterparts. And then rounding out, if you have to absolutely have X570 for some reason in a small form factor, you can get the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Pro Wi-Fi. Pretty good connectivity on this. It does, of course, like the other ones, have BIOS flashback on it. However, I would expect more out of an X570 board because it's supposed to have more. What am I paying for here? And we have the return of this horrible chipset fan. Again, if it does its job and it's quiet, it's great. But what happens when it doesn't? Are you going to put up with that on a $200 motherboard? I'm not a big fan of it. Again, pardon the pun. And it does not have the front panel USB Type-C connector either. I hope you enjoyed that romp through best Ryzen 5000 motherboards. Leave me down in the comments. Which ones are you most interested in? What are the features that you're most looking for? And of course, remember to give the video a like if you got value out of it and subscribe for more content. With that, I'm Jason, and I'll catch you on the next one.